Chris King. I'm going to show you the latest research on entheogens and particularly the psychedelics. But first let's look at why this is important and possibly essential to our future as a species. There are three reasons for this: science, sentience and survival. The scientific revolution has elucidated the fundamental particles and forces shaping the world around us. We've also discovered how the universe comes into being on a cosmic scale. We've deciphered the genetic code and have a good understanding of the evolving diversity of life. However, there is a critical abyss in the scientific description. Despite new research into brain scans and neural networking, we still have no understanding of how the brain generates subjective consciousness. In fact, consciousness is so different from all objective phenomena that some researchers doubt this is even possible. The best we have so far is that subjective experiences correspond to globally coherent brain states, and that aspects and details of our conscious experience are mapped globally across the cerebral cortex as activated features. We don't actually have any idea of how the objective brain gives rise to the envelope of subjective experience, and yet it is subjective experience, which is the total sum of all we know from birth to death. So the question is pivotal to our understanding of life, the universe, and everything. Moreover, all our religious notions, which are some of the most powerful cultural forces driving events, both in the West and the wider world, are all dealing with our subjective conscious experiences, often in contradiction to our emerging knowledge of the natural world. Christianity in particular is in its very essence a sacramental religion.
This wine is my blood.
All the vistas of paradise, heaven, hell, and the afterlife in all the world's major religions are pivotally experiences of fantastic conscious realms. Subjective conscious experience is thus the foundation of the religious quest. Finally, we know that humanity is causing irreversible impacts on the planet, provoking a mass extinction of genetic and biological diversity on a scale of millions of years, potentially catastrophic climate change, combined with destruction of the great forests and the depletion of Earth's non-renewable resources, which is becoming a potential threat to our own future survival as a species. We remain in a state of apocalyptic confrontation amid bouts of war and genocide over conflicting worldviews and amid weapons of planetary mass destruction.
Allahu Akbar.
By helping us show how subjective consciousness comes about, entheogens may provide not only a spiritual guide to our integration, but a natural key to how our most intimate subjective experiences relate to the universe at large. Psychedelics have become one of our culture's greatest taboos because they pose an existential threat to Western conservative, religious, capitalist, military ideals. You only have to watch this extravagant account to understand why the psychedelic revolution was met with fear and loathing by the powers that be.
The reality is we are one with God and He loves us. Now, if that isn't a hazard to this country, you see my point. How are we going to keep building nuclear weapons? You know what I mean? What's going to happen to the arms industry when we realize we're all one? It's going to fuck up the economy that's fake anyway.
However, the other side of this coin is that, given responsible and respectful use, entheogens may hold a key to our sustainable future. Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, in his New Scientist interview, highlights the apocalyptic fear of the entheogenic power of psychedelics. He sees a redemption of social attitudes arising in our coming to terms with their long traditions of sacred use, which we shall investigate shortly. To understand how this situation has come about, we need to take a quick look at the conscious brain. Here you can see the brain overarched by the wrinkled cerebral cortex, divided into prefrontal executive functions. Left centre the somatosensory touch and motor cortices, behind them the parietal cortex to do with spatial imagery, followed by the visual cortex to the rear. To either side are the auditory and temporal cortices to do with time and memory, and on the inner plane the emotional cingulate cortex. Neural pathways to and from the cortex pass through midbrain centres in the thalamus and basal ganglia, forming vertical feedback connections through a loop between the cortex and thalamus via the basal nuclei. Surrounding the periphery of the cortical sheet is the limbic system, dealing with emotions, flight and fight, and the consolidation of sequential memories pivotal to survival. Cortical activation responds to diverse aspects of a given experience, as illustrated in these scans of different language-related functions, followed by a series of scans for melody, pitch, and other specific aspects of music in a rotating brain. The cerebral cortex is divided into two hemispheres connected by a massive parallel set of fibres called the corpus callosum, and there is evidence the two hemispheres have complementary functions, particularly in language and analytical thought. Finally, there are several sets of ascending neural pathways involving the neurotransmitters serotonin and norepinephrine, making synapses with excitatory pyramidal cells in layers 3 and 5 of the cerebral cortex, and with inhibitory interneurons, governing sleep, dreaming and wakefulness, and changes of mood. These arise from basal brain centres, the raphe nucleus and locus ceruleus, and spread out widely across the cortex, affecting the overall modality of processing. A similar dopamine pathway to do with reward seeking rises to frontal areas. This is where our interest in neurotransmitters and psychotropic substances becomes key. Consequently, binding scans for the various types of serotonin receptor show widely distributed binding across the cortex as a whole. These considerations are shared by other receptors such as the cannabinoid CB1 receptor and the adenosine receptor activated by caffeine. Neurotransmitters such as serotonin and norepinephrine are very ancient and provide an essential role in keeping electroactivity of the brain attuned to organismic survival. Serotonin goes back to the first photosynthetic organisms and is used as a signaling molecule in a variety of single-celled protozoans, from amoeba to ciliates. It is used for neuronal signaling in the first organisms with neurons, the cnidarians. The function of serotonin and other amine neurotransmitters such as dopamine has been conserved strongly throughout the evolution of multicelled animals, with divergence of the major classes of serotonin receptor before the divergence of mollusks, insects and vertebrates, conserving generically similar roles throughout evolution. Given the organismic function of the neurotransmitters in the sappy chemical brain, it is little wonder that virtually every culture that has come upon psychoactive substances has adopted them as an integral part of their culture, often for spiritual purposes. We can find evidence of opium use with the founding cultures of Egypt and Minoan Crete around 4,000 years ago, confirmed in the Minoan poppy goddess figurine, whose head is crowned with slit poppy pods, with a scene on a seal displaying ritual use of poppy pods by Minoan priestesses. Egyptian juglets found in Cyprus have the same form as an inverted poppy pod, implying an international trade in poppy extract. Cannabis use was also accounted among the Scythians, who used braziers and tents to inhale the smoke. Cannabis also has a very early origin in India, where it appears in the Vedas up to 4,000 years ago, and in the person of Shiva, seated as Pashupatinath, lord of the animals, at Mohenjo-daro. Shiva remains the patron of ganja-smoking Shiva sadhus to this day. The source of the visionary apoptya of Eleusis remains a mystery, but one suggestive wall frieze has Persephone offering what looks like a liberty-capped psilocybe to Demeter. In Europe, the use of mandrake, henbane and belladonna, part of the pre-Christian herbal folklore of the old goddess to induce deliriant visitations, became an accursed manifestation of witchcraft associated with sexual concourse with the devil. The witch hunts, culminating in condemnation by the Inquisition to being burned at the stake, illustrate the extreme attitude of paranoia of Christian culture to the ritual use of visionary sacraments. Part of the dilemma facing our acceptance of psychedelic entheogens is that their discovery and ritual use occurs almost exclusively in the Americas, where they've been revered as spiritual sacraments, without exception, by every culture that has come upon them. Maya mushroom stones dating back 3,000 years demonstrate the sacred use of mushrooms, including the use of the metate to grind them, as is still done among the Mazatecs. The Aztecs likewise displayed frescoes of sacred mushroom use, and their use in festivals is recorded by the conquistadors. In South America, artifacts of the Paracas culture 2,500 years ago also record the ritual use of sacred mushrooms associated with visionary flights. By contrast, the conquistadors and their flagellating priests in their paranoia regarded all use of sacred species as diabolical and repressed ritual sacred practices altogether. All record of the sacred mushroom use became lost for 500 years until the Mazatec curandero, Maria Sabina, broke the code of silence and held a sacred mushroom velada for the mycologist Gordon Wasson, who she had had a vision would come to seek them. Within days, the CIA were informed and dispatched a mole to spy on the next trip to Huautla. One of her sons was killed and her house burned down in retribution. Here we see unique footage of Maria collecting wild mushrooms from the hills above her house. Here she is performing a sacred mushroom velada with both native and Christian elements. Until very recently, the use of sacred mushrooms remained legal in Holland, which has had a long tradition of tolerance. Here we see the sacred mushroom gallery with 2 species of psilocybe on sale. Tiana Nakatal. Here we go with the flesh of the gods, the soma. Now,
she
knew as a child what mushrooms they were, and she was very hungry. And the mushrooms were growing in the fields where they were shepherding sheep. So she and her sister would get absolutely beside themselves so that they were laughing and crying. Their grandparents couldn't chastise them. They knew essentially the fear and paranoia that it would cause young children to do that. Peyote likewise has a long history of sacred use. A peyote snuffing pipe from Toltec Monte Alban, dating from 2,500 years ago, shows the sacred deer with a peyote in its mouth. The same little deer the Huichols still refer to on their 500-kilometre peyote pilgrimage to the deserts of Wirikuta. Huichols refer in their yarn paintings to the Narika, or portal, which peyote opens to other states of consciousness in the spiritual world. It is also the original God's eye, peyote, the little deer, and the ancestors. Here we see collecting peyote on a Huichol pilgrimage and the Huichol elder Don Jose Matsua, who dreamed of Brant Secunda lying in the desert and sent out men to rescue him and bring him back to learn the arts of healing. Here we see Tell Us Good Morning, my own peyote roadman from Taos Pueblo, after a peyote meeting in 1992 at the age of 93. In South America, a variety of visionary sacraments have been revered, including the San Pedro cactus, originally by the Chavan and Nazca cultures dating back to 2,900 years ago, but also today as seen here with Eduardo Calderon, the San Pedro shaman. In addition, these cultures used hallucinogenic snuffing pipes, as is still practiced by tribes in the Amazon today. But by far the most renowned sacrament of the Amazon is the vine of the soul, rope of the dead, or ayahuasca, a brew made of 2 plants, chacruna, containing the psychedelic DMT, and the age vine containing the monoamine oxidase inhibitor harmine. In combination, these induce powerful visions when the brewer is drunk. Ayahuasca is used widely in the Amazon by traditional tribes in ritual ceremonies, accompanied by singing or sounding deep Urupari trumpets. paintings of Pablo Amaringo give a visionary artist's view of the ayahuasca experience. Here is Senor Trinico, the ayahuasca shaman I met in 1980 during a return night ceremony we took with him in 1999. Ayahuasca is also consumed in the UDV, or Union Vegetal, a religious movement originating in the 20th century in visionary church meetings where people can share their experiences and recount their visions together. Finally, if we turn back to the African continent, we find iboga, another entheogenic plant of ancient use to revisit the ancestors, consumed ritually as a rite of passage by many tribal groups throughout the Congo Basin, including the Biaka Pygmies, who along with the Bushmen are one of the most ancient peoples of Africa. Before looking at entheogens in the brain, let's examine two other major modes of inner conscious state, dreaming sleep and meditation and prayer. When a person is scanned by PET or f-MRI when they are in the midst of the rapid eye movement phases of dreaming sleep, although their electroencephalograms look almost identical to waking, prefrontal activation is consistently diminished in favour of activation of visual areas. This reflects the bizarre nature of dreams as experienced episodes over which one often has diminished control. For example, it is very difficult to bring oneself to recognise one is dreaming and become lucid. By contrast, meditation is a practice engaged in the waking condition. In waking life, when we stop attending to a functional task, a special brain network fires up called the default network. This has an obvious evolutionary function, rehearsing situations which could be of immediate survival value, but it is also the source of daydreaming and worry. The default network was discovered because areas with decreases during specific tasks also had increases during pauses. Zen emptiness meditation tends to activate prefrontal regions which serve to suppress the default network to retain one-pointed concentration. This may result in synchrony in the gamma wave band of the EEG, generally associated with active cognitive and sensory processing, again consistent with a stable resonant state of focus. By contrast, Carmelite nuns practicing union with the divine tend to activate regions to do with having an immediate emotional rapport with another being whom one strongly trusts. Likewise, Tibetan Buddhist compassion meditation tends to bring out regions which might be associated with emotional caring. Transcendental meditators practice a form of yogic relaxation, promoting calm and ease, associated by some researchers with a rise in inhibitory GABA neuronal activity. All of these meditative approaches, with the exception of speaking in tongues, which saw a reduction in prefrontal activity, result in a mentally focused, ordered state. They contrast with dreaming and having a much higher degree of prefrontal control. Entheogens provide an altogether different route to altered states of consciousness, in which the contents of experience are augmented by complex additional forms of awareness, from kaleidoscopic visual patterns to dreamlike experiences and visions. One can also meditate on entheogens, but meditation on its own does not provide access to the very different kinds of changes brought about by entheogens, which are not a product of prefrontal control and are closer to the changes brought about by dreaming. PET and f-MRI brain scans of people under psychedelics have so far been highly contradictory. A PET scan on psilocybin showed increases in prefrontal activity over the resting state when the subjects were tested 45 minutes or so after ingesting psilocybin. By contrast, an f-MRI study for a brief window of a few minutes after injecting psilocybin showed a marked reduction in prefrontal activity. Some commentators have associated this with initial anxiety at the early onset before the effects have matured. A third study on ayahuasca, again over longer periods, showed more specific activations in prefrontal and paralimbic areas consistent with the psychedelic state, inducing both cognitive and emotional arousal. A fourth study shows how the distracting effects of hallucinations may suppress the brain's ability to maintain an illusion generated by a kinesa triangle. This emphasizes a point that one should not expect a single type of brain scan response from a psychedelic, as its effects will vary extensively depending on the task or otherwise invoked, because the effects are subtle and highly dependent on setting and activity. How do psychedelics cause such brain changes? Here is a selection of key psychoactive molecules. The psychedelics fall into two groups, the one-ring phenylethylamine centre and the hybrid ring tryptamines lower, with LSD being a modified tryptamine. Another class of entheogens are the dissociatives typified by the anesthetic ketamine above. An agonist binds to a receptor and turns it partly or fully on. An antagonist binds and prevents a receptor being excited. and inverse agonists bind and inhibit even spontaneous baseline activity. Other psychoactive molecules such as reuptake inhibitors and releasing agents affect the transporters which modulate neurotransmitter levels in the synapse. Psilocin, the active molecule in sacred mushrooms, for example, is very similar to serotonin with a slightly different charge arrangement. Both classes of psychedelic are agonists at the serotonin or 5-hydroxytryptamine 5-HT2A receptor, even though some are phenylethylamines rather than tryptamines. Although all psychedelics activate the 5-HT2A receptor believed to be the site of psychedelic action, they also bind to a broad spectrum of other receptor types, so their effects are complex and varied. Many of the tunnel and vortex-like visual effects of psychedelics can be explained through travelling waves on the visual cortex below, mapped by a complex exponential function onto the subjective visual field above. This suggests part of the changes caused by psychedelics result from waves of excitation passing across the cerebral cortex in addition to the usual patterns resulting from sensory processing. However, synesthesia or sensory mixing may involve enhanced resonances between interconnected sensory regions such as hearing and seeing. To explain the complex kaleidoscopic synesthesic and fractal sensory effects, there are a variety of possible processes. The basal brain centers forming the ascending pathways of serotonin, norepinephrine and dopamine link to pyramidal neurons in the cortex and also to inhibitory interneurons. Psychedelics could thus act by directly affecting the fast glutamate excitability of the pyramidal cells containing 5-HT2 receptors, which fire off information to other parts of the brain, or reducing the inhibitory smoothing of the GABA interneurons. They could also cause resonant excitatory changes by modifying feedback between the cortex and thalamus. Finally, by altering activity in the basal brain centers mediating arousal and vigilance, they can precipitate a dreamlike condition. However, not all serotonin 2A receptor agonists are psychedelics. Indeed, serotonin itself is not, and just has a general effect on mood, appetite and wakefulness. Neither are several lysergic acid derivative agonists. Psychedelics thus cause their weird and wonderful effects by binding to 5-H2A receptors in an exceptional way which causes novel changes. This is a different kind of response from most other psychoactive neurotransmitter molecules which generally just activate their receptor in the usual way. The serotonin receptor belongs to the superfamily of heptahelical G-protein linked receptors. G-linked receptors do not open ion channels but precipitate a chain of protein reactions causing long-term activation or depression. One idea has been that psychedelics cause the receptor to activate the PLA2 pathway rather than the PLC pathway. But this results in a contradiction because LSD and psilocin fall at opposite extremes and inactive LSD derivative lyseride and serotonin itself fall nearer the center. More recently, a genetic assay of which proteins were activated by psychedelic and non-psychedelic serotonin agonists found one particular protein, EGR2 or early growth releaser 2, was uniquely activated by psychedelics, while C-FOS related to the PLC pathway was activated by all agonists. Cell stains show the expression of EGR2 corresponds to the cells containing 5-H2A receptors, confirming the link. EGR2 is expressed both in early development and in neuroplasticity, but we don't know exactly how its expression relates to the altered mind state. A deep insight into this possible activity has come from studies into how different types of receptor molecule may interact functionally, especially on pyramidal cells in the cortex. Many receptors form dimers or other associations so that they can become functionally related. In particular, studies have shown a push-pull relationship between the 5-HT2A receptor and a G-linked glutamate receptor, MGLUR2, which acts to smooth out and modulate the fast electrical excitation of glutamate ionotropic receptors. Thus, serotonin agonist psychedelics seem to inhibit the smoothing action of MGLUR2, possibly causing the waves of cortical excitation that may invoke the sensory effects of psychedelics. Conversely, MGLUR2 agonists and serotonin antagonists may act as antipsychotics by stabilizing fast glutamate activity. This could thus give a common explanation of psychoses and the positive effects of psychedelics. Once again, in cellular assay, the 5-HT2A MGLUR2 relationship can be confirmed to be manifested in pyramidal neurons expressing both receptors together. This connection also brings in an intriguing relationship with the next class of entheogens we're going to look at, the dissociatives. It turns out there is also a second push-pull relationship between these agents and MGLUR2, which suggests a deep common mechanism in the entheogenic effects of these two very different agents, whose superficial effects and modes of action are completely distinct. Dissociatives like ketamine act by a completely different route, blocking the ionophore NMDA receptors triggered by glutamate and glycine together that play another key role in mediating glutamate excitability. Ketamine is an anesthetic and can cause major changes in brain dynamics, inducing a state of dissociation in which the person is conscious but has immense difficulty moving, and their experience is sufficiently disconnected from their bodily sensations to make it possible to perform major operations, at the same time causing a sensory flood of disembodied perceptions and out-of-body experiences. Once again, there is ambiguity of how its effects can occur, because at lower doses, blocking the activity of inhibitory neurons could cause potentially damaging hyperexcitation, while higher doses blocking the main excitatory pathways result in anesthesia. Brain scans on ketamine show distinct patterns of inhibition in prefrontal areas and activation in cingulate areas at the onset, and of generally reduced activity when trying to carry out an active visual task. This is the end point which scientific discovery has reached as of the time of producing this documentary. It provides a fascinating insight into how the peak experiences of two very different classes of entheogen may trigger fundamental processes which have also been associated with near-death experiences, and together may provide a key to how the enigmatic process of subjective consciousness is generated by the living brain.